Hello, welcome to the 2024 Minnesota TZD Traffic Safety Hot Dish, a roadmap for traffic safety culture research and the road ahead. I'm Christine Hernandez, the State Towards Zero Death Communications and Marketing Director, and I'll be moderating the session today. I want to thank the Minnesota Departments of Health, Public Safety and Transportation, as well as NHTSA for being today's sponsors of the webinar. And just some housekeeping tips. We are going to be recording this webinar for future use, and we'll be posting that within 24 hours. All of the attendees today will be muted, and then we will have professional development hours on a form on our webpage, which is listed below, and also in the chat. We do have two features for you to interact with our panelists today. We prefer that you put any questions for our speakers in the Q&A section. They'll be located at the bottom of your screen. And then if you want to just make general comments, please put those in the chat, or if you need technical assistance and that sort of thing. So our first speaker today is Dr. Wes Kumfer, Engineering Research Associate at the University of North Carolina Highway Safety Research Center. He has a focus on crash analysis and workforce development. His primary research interest is traffic safety management through a systems-oriented approach. While at HSRC, Kumfer has worked on pedestrian crash modeling, safe system implementation, and engineering evaluation. He uses this experience as a member of the Road to Zero Coalition steering group and as an instructor for HSRC's Road Safety Academy. So with that, I will turn it over to Wes.
Thank you so much, Christine. Really appreciate the invitation, and thank you everyone for being here today. And I think Jack, oh, there it goes. Perfect. So today I'm going to be talking to you about a traffic safety culture research roadmap that we produced as part of an NCHRP project. And so if you could go ahead and go to the next slide, Jackson. I'd like to start out with a brief poll. If you could just put this in the chat pod, I am curious, what do you as an attendee think traffic safety culture is? So I have some options here. You could say it's driver behavior or attitudes and beliefs or organizational culture. All of the above, none of the above. If you have something else, please just go ahead and put it in the chat, and I'll give you just a couple minutes to do so. Maybe just 1 minute. Oh, it says the chat is disabled. I see Nick said all of the above. Okay. Any other thoughts? Driver behavior, okay. And I see all but primarily attitudes and beliefs. Yeah, so I think several people picked out multiple options there. All of the above. Yes, very good. So thank you for at least putting in some of those responses in the Q&A. And I would say keep this question in mind, because I think it is one of the fundamental things that we wrestle with when it comes to working as agencies to improve traffic safety culture is, what do we actually mean by that? So Jackson, if you could go ahead to the next slide. So yeah, traffic safety culture, it does often come up as something that's very critical for doing transportation safety in the United States. We talk about it in relation to the safe system approach as something that needs to be shored up. It comes up a lot in a lot of guidance documents. I've seen it in strategic highway safety plans and state highway safety plans. It's something that most of us feel intrinsically that we need to do. And yet I would argue that there isn't really a consensus on what traffic safety culture is. And if there isn't a consensus on what it is, we don't necessarily have a good sense of what research is needed or what kind of projects we need to do in order to implement or change traffic safety culture. So the project that we developed or conducted to develop this research roadmap was really intended to help agencies move from some of these initial steps where they are defining traffic safety culture to ultimately putting together long-term programs that can help them achieve Vision Zero. Go ahead, Jackson. So the specific goals of NCHRP Project 1796, from which I'm going to be drawing most of my slides, were to identify traffic safety culture gaps in knowledge, meaning what is it that people know and what is it that they don't know, and what do they not know that they don't know, right? And then taking that information together by talking to a number of different stakeholders to produce a prioritized research roadmap that ended up laying out sort of a pathway forward toward a safe system. We also developed a communication plan to share these results. Me being here, talking to you today is part of that communication plan. And again, I really do appreciate the invitation. And then we also put together a process management plan to talk about how it is that we can go ahead implementing some of these research results. And I would argue that today, some of that implementation plan is also being achieved, but really what we were focusing on is what are the next steps once you get to where you're thinking about traffic safety culture? How do you do some self-assessments? And then maybe identify what needs or work your agency needs to do. So on the next slide, I'll talk about what the specific questions that we really wanted to answer for people reading this report was. So what is traffic safety culture? What makes it positive? Because that's often what we see it framed as a positive traffic safety culture. How do you measure traffic safety culture? How do you change it? And then how do you evaluate it? And what research do you need to understand it? So the project that we conducted had multiple steps. We did a literature review. We hosted multiple workshops with dozens of stakeholders. We interviewed a number of different stakeholders from all sorts of different disciplines. We had DOT folks, we had planners, we had law enforcement involved in some of the workshops. We talked to some OEMs and some researchers to really try to understand what is the system, what is the universe of traffic safety culture? How do these pieces fit together? We did some mapping and ultimately wrote lots and lots and lots of drafts of these research needs statements that I'm going to be discussing today. So go ahead. Ultimately, I think, though, where we need to start when we're talking about what the literature says about traffic safety culture is answering this question of what is culture, right? So if you could hit the next. Very good. I would argue, yeah, thank you so much. Based on what we see in the literature, culture can be roughly thought of as the system of shared and interrelated beliefs, values, attitudes, and norms that shape behaviors or practices. Now, when you read that, yeah, you should be thinking, well, if we're focusing on traffic safety, we kind of might just consider it a shorthand of driver behavior. But there are a lot of things that end up being not stated when we're talking about driver behavior. Like, why do people behave the way that they do on the roadway? And so if you go to the next slide, if we're thinking about this as maybe something a little bit more than driver behavior, go ahead on the next. We could start to envision safety culture as within our discipline, the universe or the envelope that contains everything that we think of with the safe system approach. So the safe speeds, the safe road users, the post-crash care, the safe vehicles, and the safe roads. If we think about everything that ties in together to produce a safe system, that's a pretty broad topic. And so if you can go ahead and go to the next slide, Jackson. And we see a shift in the literature and how people have talked about and defined traffic safety culture over time, where in the earlier definitions, we do see people saying, well, it's your worldview that influences the traffic system. It is the behaviors that are normal in your peer group, or is the social climate in which traffic safety is highly valued and rigorously pursued. And then you start to look at, well, we do have this social climate. This affects our underlying assumptions and beliefs and attitudes within a community. But then we start to branch out and look at this last definition. Jay, who's my co-panelist here, has written quite a bit about this, that we're moving away from not just those shared values among road users, but also how is it that we as stakeholders intersect with all this? Because if it is more than just road user behavior, then we need to think about what our role as an organization or as a profession is in shaping that road user behavior. So if you could hit the next one more time. Yeah, so we start to think about our systemic forces that influence transportation. Sometimes here at HSRC, we talk about these as the off right-of-way problems, what are the reasons why people are choosing the modes or choosing the routes, choosing the behaviors, maybe not even choosing them, maybe subconsciously electing to speed or to not put on their seatbelts, because not all behavior is deliberative. But what are these systemic forces that can or cannot be influenced by our roadway design? Go ahead to the next slide. And you see some models of this that have popped up in the literature from time to time. So I do like this diagram from May et al. From 2008, where they look at what are the things that we as road users value. It could be things like community or well-being and slow movements. And how do these particular values intersect with our transportation safety or road safety? Versus what are some other values that you might experience culturally, such as individualism or consumerism or a culture of speed, that maybe influence the likelihood of crashes. So we've seen some of these concepts also pop up in some of the other models that people have developed for traffic safety culture, such as the socioeconomic environment and how that influences behaviors, but also how it intersects with the physical environment to produce risks that then people, when they elect to do certain driver behaviors, end up getting into crashes. And so both of these bottom two figures come from the Towards Zero Deaths National Strategy. But what I really want to illustrate with an example is that traffic safety culture is bigger than just whether or not I choose to speed when I am driving. And if we think about the reasons for why people speed, well, it could be that maybe we've designed a roadway with very wide lanes, large setbacks on our buildings, maybe large shoulders. We realize that there are visual friction cues that people take when they're driving that can cause people to slow down or speed up very naturally. And so maybe they just are receiving cues from their built environment that they can go faster than the design speed. Maybe there's a local culture of speeding because maybe everyone there is in a hurry. Maybe there is not a lot of support for working remotely. Maybe everyone still commutes to a job and people just want to get there as fast as they can so that they can get things done and get back home. This creates a sort of feedback loop of people wanting to speed, maybe even subconsciously. And then you think about, well, why have we set up a system where you have these large setbacks for buildings, where you have such a wide space? And it comes down to maybe housing availability, the job market. There are all these other things that are off right of way that aren't in our engineering design manuals that can influence that ultimate subconscious speed selection that someone has. And so when we're dealing with traffic safety culture, we really do need to think beyond just our behaviors. Those are part of it, but we need to think beyond those behaviors to think about our communities, our societies, and school and work, and how these all intersect with the individual. So go ahead to the next slide. But if we really want to frame this in terms of what can we positively achieve, so next, we could see that we are looking for both those road users and the stakeholders and how both pieces can improve traffic safety. So go ahead. This definition and model I really like from Girasek in 2012 starts with traffic safety being valued. So we as a profession value traffic safety. I would argue that road users also value traffic safety. But if we could really get that value inbuilt, then we could start to hold institutions accountable for traffic safety and how they influence the way that people use the road. We could start to, say, monitor how many crashes are occurring on roadways or other measures. Maybe we're looking at the number of sidewalks built. And we could start to promote policies such as transit access or equity support, maybe looking at making sure that there are good facilities all throughout a city. And then maybe those allow individuals to select to, say, not drive or to drive slower. And that sort of provides a feedback loop for how traffic safety is valued. So go ahead. So thinking about all of those models that are in the literature and that sort of relationship that we uncovered looking at the broader system of things, we also tried to look at a wide variety of different psychological and cultural theories and disciplines and how they intersect with traffic safety culture to see if there were lessons we could pull into the research roadmap. It's a little bit too much to get into all of this. There are some that were more important than others, but we really were trying to cast a wide net to think about what have people said about culture and how can we pull that into the research and the kind of work that can be done by agencies to improve positive traffic safety culture. So go ahead. Ultimately, what we ended up finding in the research, and Jay's going to talk a bit more about this, is that traffic safety culture research tends to fall into four buckets. And most of the work, I would argue, is still at the definition phase. What is it? what do we mean by it versus the other agencies that we work with, and how can we work together? You do see some folks starting to get into measurements where maybe they're looking at indicators of specific culture. I know Jay has done some work around cannabis use while driving. And then maybe we get into what kind of projects could we actually develop and put into place to shift traffic safety culture. And then maybe when you start thinking very long term, you start thinking about, well, how does the culture change over time? And how do we even monitor and evaluate that? So go ahead. After we had discerned these different buckets of traffic safety culture, we realized that we needed to start talking to some of our stakeholders. Several dozen traffic safety stakeholders I mentioned, we hosted 2 workshops with them to just uncover how they think about traffic safety culture and what they think about safety and how these pieces fit together. And then we took those insights from them, identified some research gaps, and then vetted those with the specific interviews that we hosted. Then from those interviews, we developed some draft research needs statements and then took those to a single DOT that had an embedded state highway safety office working with them, as well as law enforcement officers and several others who have a role in implementing traffic safety culture, and refined our research needs statements, and then ultimately sent out a survey to several more DOTs to get a prioritized list. So go ahead. During that first workshop, we really were trying to uncover what is a practitioner's mental model for safety. So we asked them questions like, what is safety? What do you believe the primary causes of crashes are? What do you believe the most effective way to prevent crashes are? And what do you believe are the 2 most responsible groups for preventing crashes? And how important is what is the most important influence on culture? So on the next slide, you'll see that we took all of these different responses that we got, and we're trying to orient them around post-pandemic crashes, because most of us have seen that there has been a shift in traffic safety culture from the pandemic. Speeding is up, lack of restraint use is up, single vehicle crashes at night are up. We see that maybe there's just more aggressive driving. Something shifted, right? And so we tried to get people, these practitioners, to think through what happened. And they pointed out a lot of things that we as engineers or planners or law enforcement maybe aren't really working on. And maybe it's outside of our domain, but we need to expand our thinking a little bit. And that would be like pandemic pressure and mental health issues, how these affect negative psychological states. Are there hospital issues? Is there unemployment? Is there a lack of housing? And so this is just one example of several of these systems diagrams that we put together. This is kind of sloppy. This was a rough work. And we started to piece things together, and I'll show you a more complete system map in a second, but we took this into the second workshop. So on the next slide, we then started to dial down into the role that one of those specific stakeholders has in traffic safety culture. And in this map of things that we started to piece together, and we used what we called a 5 R's exercise, which is where we ask someone to define their role in transportation safety. We ask them to highlight the resources that they rely on. So if you're an engineer, these resources could be your state highway design manual or your MUTCD. If you're in other discipline, you probably have some technical manuals and policies that you have to follow. Or it could also be the data sets that you are looking at as a resource for your role. We talked about the relationships that these different stakeholders have together. So if you're a law enforcement officer, are you able to share your insights into driver behavior with your public works department or not? That kind of thing. We talked about the rules that people have to follow. So these could be design standards. It could be, laws that are specific to your jurisdiction. And then we asked folks to focus on the results that they want to produce, whichever one used the safe system approach as what they wanted to achieve. So on the next slide, you'll see that we pieced all these 5 R's together. Again, this is just an example of what one of the working groups did during that workshop. And you'll see things like elected official protocols and enforcement and agency protocols, and started to piece everything together. So on the next slide, you'll see an example of ultimately we took all those different things that we got from all the different working groups. And I realize that this is a little hard to read. I mostly just want you to see the scope of it. And we pieced it together to say, well, this seems to be the transportation system that produces traffic safety culture. And well, it kind of feels like everything, right? If you've been listening along and you've been noticing that I've been talking about housing and jobs and mental health, the universe of things that influence culture suddenly gets very, very big. And so we started to think, well, what can an agency do? And this is where we decided that organizational culture, meaning the culture that dictates how your transportation organization does things, is sort of your inroad to intersect with road users and to intersect with other agencies so that you can work together to ultimately move toward a safe system. So if you go to the next slide, did want to call out a couple things that some of these other practitioners highlighted. First, they noted that our current culture does seem to be very auto-centric, and maybe this is something worth examining whenever we're thinking about that system of things. And on the next slide, folks pointed out that the traveling public is kind of an underutilized resource for safety culture. And by that, I mean that when we think about our organizational culture and the way that we work together with our partners to produce traffic safety, we maybe aren't thinking about the public as a partner, but perhaps the public really actually values walkability and bikeability, and that's something they want. And maybe if they could share those values with us, then we can identify projects that will help them achieve their goals while we achieve ours of reducing crashes. So if you go to the next slide, we ultimately seeded these topics, these ideas into 27 different research gaps that we fit into the different buckets. And I'm not going to read all these, but I do just want to point out a few of them. One thing you will notice if you do read through these is that several of them sort of fit into multiple buckets as they kind of tie definition to measurement to development to evaluation. But we did try to identify research needs that would address each of these buckets. So we could start with something very basic, like identifying the purpose of defining traffic safety culture for different stakeholders, or developing models to link senses of identity in place. So how can we measure that? Or on the next slide, we start to get into some actual projects that an agency could undertake, like building necessary resources to support and envision positive traffic safety culture. Like, what sort of project can you do to build political will for Vision Zero? Or how can you monitor changes in beliefs over time so that you can know that your projects are having an impact? So if you go to the next slide, you'll see that we took all of these different gaps, and we wrote research need statements that would address at least one of them. There were 27 gaps. We ended up writing 20 research need statements, so some of them do address multiple. But we put these into TRB format to get them into the TRB research need statement pipeline to hopefully end up influencing the kinds of problem statements that come through NCHRP or through DOT research programs to really get these out there to get folks thinking about, okay, what sort of traffic safety culture research do we need as a country to move toward a safe system? And so you'll see on the next slide, if we just pull out some examples of some of these, and we developed a full set, like a two-pager for each of these. Within the definition domain, we had some research need statements like linking intra-agency traffic safety culture goals. So what are your goals as a DOT, and what are your goals as a state highway safety office? And how do these intersect with each other? Do we have the same goals? Do we differ? Where and why do we differ? And how can we come to an agreement on how we locally view traffic safety culture so that we can move toward a Vision Zero? Within the measurement domain, we see things like an annual traffic safety culture measurement and assessment tool that a community could send out year after year to actually get that public feedback and to understand what it is that they're road users locally really value and prioritize. And then things like building community-led traffic safety culture coalitions. So again, how is it that you can work with the public and tap into their identity and perceptions of traffic safety culture? So on the next slide, you'll see some of the development ones. And here we had some ideas like what sort of enduring policies are needed to sustain traffic safety culture efforts and programs. This was something that actually came up multiple times with discussion of different stakeholders, was that it's all well and good to have a Vision Zero statement, but if there's a change in elected office, sometimes some of the political will for that statement, if you were relying on that specific elected official to be the champion of that idea, sometimes that political will can go away. So how is it that we can sustain the sort of efforts that will allow us to achieve a Vision Zero or allow us to implement the safe system approach, regardless of who's in office? And I think that's something that if we all value reducing crashes and preventing injuries, then I think maybe that's something for us to think about. And then we also had what about agency risk management and public goals and pathways to a safe system. So I've heard a lot about liability, whether it's a concern that if you do something experimental, you'll be liable for it, Or if you don't do something, will you be liable for it? And this was just putting a research needs statement out there to kind of help agencies figure out, well, what is the liability concerns and risk management related to the safe system approach? So on the next slide, you'll see the final set that related to evaluation. These include things like evaluating the impact of roadway investments on traffic safety culture. So, if we put in all these countermeasures, what is the long-term effect of our local culture? And then also some workforce development topics like building a long-term monitoring framework for benchmarking traffic safety. What sort of skill sets do you need to get there? So if you go to the next slide, you'll see that ultimately we arrived at this idea that if the safe system is our goal, and if that safe system is characterized culturally by 0 deaths, 0 injuries, a feeling of security, whether you're riding the bus or riding your bike, equity, so that there aren't certain subpopulations who are more impacted by traffic safety outcomes than others, and affordance in your ability to choose what kind of mode of transportation best suits your needs, then what sort of research is needed to get there? And we envisioned this as a positive thing, but we did sort of highlight the different topics around mode choice, missions and goals, and attitudes and beliefs that can help us think through how we get to the safe system. So Jay's going to talk a little bit more about this figure. But we ended this project by focusing on implementation. So drawing from the North Carolina Vision Zero program and their community readiness model, we wanted to think through, well, how can an agency know if they're ready to even start doing traffic safety culture work? So on the next slide, I'll just illustrate that we actually did a example workshop with one agency where we asked them how much they agreed or disagreed with a series of statements from each of the different buckets that we had in our traffic safety culture domain. And so we asked them questions like, your organization uses evaluations to improve roadway investments, or your organization evaluates internal and external relationships. We asked for their level of agreements, and then depending on how much they agreed or disagreed, we pointed out some research needs statements that may benefit them help move as a Vision Zero task force toward greater agreements and greater realization of traffic safety culture readiness. So in conclusion, traffic safety culture is a complex topic. I hope you took away from all the many, many, many words that I showed you in these slides that when you start to zoom out, you really are dealing with a lot of things culturally. But what we hoped to achieve with this roadmap is to set out a trajectory for traffic safety culture research nationally that an individual agency could take a look at and say, well, here's how ready we are to do this work. Here's the research that we need, and here's how it will contribute to the national conversation. And so we even helped one agency think through how to measure and assess that readiness. And with that, I just want to acknowledge the rest of my project team and thank them. And thank you for attending. And I think we're going to pass it to Jay at this point.
Yes, we are. And thank you, Wes. That was very informative. And as you said, traffic safety culture is very complex. So we'll learn some more about that from Jay Otto, who's a researcher for the Center for Health and Safety Culture at Montana State University. He received a bachelor's and master's degree in engineering and is fascinated by human behavior, how mindsets and systems influence behavior, and ways of growing culture within communities and organizations that foster improved health and safety. So with that, we will turn it over to Jay.
Thank you very much, Christine, and a great job, Wes, setting up the initial part. I was fortunate to be on the team with Wes. Wes, I think, had about 6 or 7 partners on 1796, and as complex as traffic safety culture is, clearly creating a roadmap for research for it is even more complex, and navigating 6 or 7 partners through that. Wes did an outstanding job. It was great to work with, so congratulations on your work on that. So I'm going to build on what Wes was talking about and then sort of talk and go into sort of some of the where things have been unfolding and some of the current or past projects that have already sort of explored aspects of this space. So on the next slide, we've got those 4 domains that Wes mentioned, which is sort of how the roadmap was organized. And let's just bring up a quick poll. And I'm doing a bit of a forced choice. But which of these do you think is most important to you? Definition, measurement, development, evaluation, and of course you could go for all 4. So if you want to respond to that, that would be great. Just see what you're thinking about that. As Wes indicated, there's definitely projects that overlap. So a project isn't just in one of these spaces, but these big buckets are helpful for us just to sort of think about aspects of the phase of the research. And also, while it's laid out linearly here, one leading to the next, there are many feedback loops, right? As we begin our measurement and development work, we may go back and rechange our definition, and our definition will evolve over time, which means our measurements have to evolve. So there are multiple feedback loops. As was mentioned, this is complex. All right, so here's an example. Here's what we can see on the screen. I think you can see the folks' responses. So the largest one, about 4 in 10, was about all 4. So yeah, recognizing that they all sort of come together. Maybe second to that is development. And I would imagine that you all in your applications could be very interested in development and thinking about how to apply things. And maybe sometimes aspects of definition or measurement may feel a little bit academic. And we very much understand that and acknowledge that. But all the pieces tie together. So thanks for sharing your thoughts on that. And that just sets us up for a little bit of a conversation here. Now, I know not all of you are from Minnesota, but I think many of you are from Minnesota. And as Wes mentioned, this is characteristic of many various safety plans across the country. But it was interesting just to pull Minnesota's recently submitted triennial highway safety plan, which I believe they're probably in their second year of the 3-year plan. And like many plans, it does include reference to this thing we call traffic safety culture, and recognizing that we need to do work on it. And that, I think, is very common in some of the behavioral plans, like the triennial highway safety plan. It tends to be in the behavioral shop and a bit more on the behavioral side. On the next slide, also looked at Minnesota's strategic highway safety plan, which is probably coming up for renewal somewhat soon. This was July of 2020. Here you can see in a plan which is both addressing behavioral and maybe engineering infrastructure and even beyond strategies, we can see this notion of traffic safety culture being in this, as Wes said, this envelope, this outside piece, and all these other elements sort of being within that, that context. And I think that's a good way for us to start thinking about it. I think it is really valuable for us to move beyond thinking about traffic safety culture as only road users or only drivers, but really thinking about how it's influencing all these aspects. And very interesting to think about it as we think about our shift across the country and growing and thinking through the lens of a safe system approach and the intersection of traffic safety culture and some of the shared values and beliefs that are embedded in the safe system approach, but also will come out as we start to embrace more of the safe system approach. But again, just to show a quick example that we have this idea of traffic safety culture absolutely being something to be important of, and this notion that it sort of surrounds many different things. So on the next slide, we do come back to the diagram that Wes included in the 1796 report. And he did a great job of describing it, but you can also, I just wanted to bring this back to sort of see the connection to many of the triennial safety plans or the strategic safety plans with this notion of the light blue ring elements of traffic safety culture surrounding these other elements and starting to influence them in a wide array of ways. So on the right-hand side, we've got the 4 domains, and those 4 domains exist around the outer layer of the circle, right? The outer layer of the circle are potential research avenues, and the numbers are actually potential research statements. And then you see those listing of the elements of traffic safety culture. This might be the content, and these are just examples, right? There are many more, but this might be the context that we're thinking about aspects of traffic safety culture. And it embraces a lot. And so we start to see those there. And then through this broad lens of culture, and as we think of a positive culture, and positive culture meaning we're going to improve health and safety, the more positive cultures leading to more health and safety. So often we're thinking through this appreciative lens and a protective factor lens. So we've got protective factors that we're also considering. And then at the inner part of the circle, some of those characteristics of a safe system. But I just want to tie this back to some of your all strategic highway safety plans and other plans mimic examples of this diagram as well. And the value of this diagram is it does connect the dots between some of the research need statements with those numbers. So you could then look up in the research roadmap, what were those various research need statements? And think about how those might be a seed for research that you all may want to do. You could use the research need statement as it's written, but you could also use it as a seed to write a modified research statement that you all as an agency may embrace on, or may even consider internally. So I think there are lots of different ways to use the research roadmap, and I just wanted to connect back to, because this diagram is great, and it does connect to, I think, existing diagrams that you may have in your strategic highway safety plans, other plans, and just helping folks make that connection. All right, on the next slide, I just want to walk through some of the examples over time that can help show what this can look like. So our center was one of the what was the leading agency on 1769. And it's interesting, it was 69, it was a piece on early traffic safety culture, and then the research roadmap was 96. Nick Ward was the director of our center at that time, and he led this project. And that's where, and I've abbreviated the definition that we came out with there, but this is where we first sort of put up a definition for traffic safety culture. And I'm always very clear to say it's a definition. We don't think it's the only definition. We wouldn't even claim that it's the best definition. We just say it's a definition. And it allows that space for other definitions to emerge. But we've sort of used it as one that we could then start with and play with it. So we sort of used it to define a space. And then if we define it this way, then what can we do? So that led us into some projects that were funded by the pooled fund on traffic safety culture. And that pooled fund started at about the same time. That's hosted by Montana DOT, and Minnesota is right now a part of that pooled fund. So the pooled fund brought many states together, and we started exploring some topics. And the first topic the pooled fund members were interested in is, well, what's the culture around driving and cannabis? This was back in 2013, 2014, and we had just seen Washington and Oregon, Colorado, some other states starting to legalize and reduce restrictions on cannabis use, and what was going to happen to impaired driving. What are people's beliefs around this? So the first project was really using this lens to say, what can we learn about people's beliefs, shared beliefs, how they relate to their values about driving under the influence of cannabis? And so we really leaned into that. We started to recruit individuals who used cannabis and wanted to see what their beliefs were about its impact on their ability to drive, their crash risk, other things like that. We also checked in with other beliefs, like, do they think it's acceptable? Do they think other people think it's acceptable? What do they think other people are doing? So a wide variety of beliefs. And that report is available, and it started to give us insights about how we might delve into shared beliefs around an issue, a very specific slice. Like, this is a narrow slice of traffic safety culture, but really thinking about driving under the influence of cannabis. And there are some important things we learned that, like, people who drive under the influence of cannabis believe that lots of people drive under the influence of cannabis, when in fact, very few people drive under the influence of cannabis. So their perception of what the norms were way off of what generally was happening. And so just different things like that. That also led to some other projects where we looked at driving under the influence of cannabis and alcohol, and some additional important beliefs come up there. A very different lens of work on this, we looked at this idea of traffic safety citizenship, which we've sort of redefined now to sort of be talking about like proactive traffic safety. And this was the whole space of, well, what are the shared beliefs amongst people that support someone speaking up to change somebody else or influence somebody else's behaviors? And in particular, we looked at texting while driving. And I think we looked at maybe wearing a seatbelt and sort of what are the shared beliefs you need to have that increase the likelihood you would ask somebody to stop texting while driving or ask somebody to wear a seatbelt. So you can see this is a very different slice, a very different aspect of traffic safety than driving under the influence of cannabis, but still an aspect of traffic safety and something we want to look at, like how could we grow more people speaking up to improve safety with the people they're in immediate proximity to. So it's a very close social relationship. And would you be comfortable speaking up? And how could we grow that? So you can see a very different kind of a project there, but still using this same idea of how do we think about this through a cultural lens. Yet a different project was thinking about law enforcement and recognizing that different kinds of law enforcement agencies have different engagement in traffic safety efforts. So we might see a highway safety, a highway patrol, a statewide agency may have a very high focus on traffic safety. And we might compare that to a sheriff's office, which may have a lower focus on traffic safety because they're working on other issues. And how might that compare to a municipal police department? So we looked at 3 kinds of agencies in several different states. And then we looked at what are the beliefs amongst those officers who were highly engaged? What are beliefs amongst officers who are not engaged? And could we create any kind of tools or resources to help grow engagement on traffic safety amongst different agencies? So again, I'm bringing this up as just a very different slice of this big topic of traffic safety culture. But where we feel like when we dive into it, we do need to sort of get a little bit of a narrow slice, because if we try to tackle it all, it's just too big. And we can learn a lot by looking at a slice. Another project we did was recognizing that seatbelt use had really gotten kind of high, which is good, getting up to 90%. But should we consider the last 10% who are not wearing their seatbelt, sort of, or never wear a seatbelt, the never users? Might they see the world differently than the 90% who do? And do we want to continue to use the same approaches that work for the 90% with the other 10%? And so this was yet another slice of traffic safety culture with a very specific behavior and a very specific subpopulation. And then we started to look at that as well at aspects of aggressive driving and how we might communicate or talk about aggressive driving and how some of the folks who might drive aggressively might react to some of that communication. Those were all aspects really around measurement, but from that measurement, we sought to give some guidance to stakeholders as to what they could do with what we learned from just trying to measure some of these components. The pooled fund now has really started to engage in aspects of development. So we had a project where we looked at multi-risk young drivers. So these were drivers who were engaging in 2 or more risky driving behaviors. And our thought was, would we want to do something differently with them? I mean, we could talk to them about seatbelts and just sort of use our seatbelt tools. We could talk to them about impaired driving and use our impaired driving tools. Or if we had folks who were doing both, are there things we might do differently with them? And that there's an intersection going on there. So this was a development of an online virtual interaction with basically college students who we recruited who were multi-risk young drivers, and then engaging them in some resources and tools to maybe grow some of their beliefs, maybe grow some harm reduction strategies, maybe grow some different ways of thinking that would grow their, grow protective behaviors and change some of that multi-risk. So that project is just wrapping up. We just submitted a draft of that report. And then another one was looking particularly at pedestrian safety, and looking at pedestrian safety not through the lens of pedestrians, but through the lens of stakeholders who make decisions about building or investing in pedestrian infrastructure, or even the role of pedestrians in a large transportation system. So this was, again, another layer or thinking about traffic safety culture, but very much less about focusing directly on the road users and more thinking about the stakeholders and the decisions that they make that then influence pedestrian safety, pedestrian behaviors, the infrastructure that exists there, with a goal of creating some tools for those stakeholders, specifically to shift some of their beliefs, thereby hopefully shifting some of their behaviors. All the projects I've described so far have been funded by the pooled fund. We also engaged in another project, which was not funded by the pooled fund. It was a multi-year project with Utah Department of Public Safety. And there it was specifically looking at, and it was a recognition of a leader at Utah Department of Public Safety, that rural seatbelt use in Utah was going to have to be approached differently than in the urban settings, and that there was more a greater libertarian mindset, and that sort of the traditional government message might not work as well in a rural setting. So what aspects of rural culture could we leverage and connect to and understand better, and thereby use and create some tools to increase seatbelt use in rural areas? So that's been a multi-year project. We've worked with public health educators and others in 9 counties so that they could work on that and build some communication tools and other things. So yet again, a different slice. And what I want you to see from these is just this work can look like many different things. It's not one thing, it's many different things, and there are different slices of it. And we do want to talk some about evaluation. And as a part of the pooled fund project, we did do a project to specifically look at, well, as we think about this evaluation domain, what's the state of the science of evaluation on efforts that are seeking to work on culture? And what we really learned from that is the evaluation domain, it's a challenging space. Evaluating cultural approaches is very difficult. Our science, in that traditional science that we think of often with evaluation, sometimes people will use the phrase like the gold standard being a random controlled trial. Those things don't really apply when we're thinking about changing a whole cultural system, because we're looking at so many different components. And this notion of, well, what would be the controls and how would we control for all the different elements is a very difficult conversation in evaluation space. And so we wanted to just see what was out there and learned. And there was a published article that we did. It was led by Professor Austin at MSU. But really the outcome was there's not a lot of great examples of efforts to evaluate truly cultural-based approaches to this work. It is very difficult. And that's going to have to be part of the research too, to understand how we might evaluate these things and understand, and the challenges in the control. And nonetheless, that can't get in the way of us being able to move forward. So those are just some quick examples. You can look at those reports on the Montana Department of Transportation. If you Google MDT, traffic safety culture, it pops up as the first link. They've got a website with all those reports, so you can check out more of those details. But at this point, I just wanted to give you an example that we can lean into and do some of this work, and have been. And you can see some examples from that. Not that this is the final by any means, or even the best work on it. All this work can be refined and done better. But it just hopefully gives some examples and some sense of what can be going on. All right, so on the next slide, I did want to share, as Wes did, just some observations and thoughts as somebody who's been doing this work now for 15 plus years. As Wes mentioned, traffic safety is complex, and I think we actually want to spend a little bit of time with that statement. That statement is not meant to say like, oh, this is too complex, we can't do anything about it. Not at all. I think what we want to take from that statement is not to ignore it, not to treat traffic safety as a technical problem. There are aspects of traffic safety which are technical problems, but traffic safety culture is really an adaptive challenge. And that means our mindset has to be a little bit different as we approach it. We have to lean into a little bit of aspects of complexity theory. We have to be comfortable looking at that diagram that Wes had with all the different arrows around it and saying, okay, I got to start thinking a little bit this way. It might not just be a straight line. It might be lots of lines curving back and influencing each other. It's a system. And we have science to help us navigate that. But as we walk into it, we need to shift our mindsets a little bit and embrace that, as opposed to rejecting that and either doing nothing, or rejecting that and thinking it's just a technical challenge and we'll just use our technical approaches, problem solving, to do it. Some of those skills are going to come to bear, but we need some new skills too. And we need to allow for emergence, which is key, and we need to allow for learning throughout everything we do. So this first bullet is one we want to talk about and acknowledge, because it does require some different skills by us. I think the safe system approach offers much hope for progress, and it does offer another framework for us to think about this work and to compartmentalize it a little bit, which is sometimes helpful when something is so big as traffic safety culture is. But I think the safe system approach is very exciting. I think we need to all lean into how the safe system approach can help us think differently. I think we want to avoid thinking about the safe system approaches. Oh, we're already doing that. Like, I can take the 4 E's and map them into the safe system approach. I'm good. I think we miss an opportunity when we do that. I think we really want to think about the safe system approach and ask ourselves, what new ways of thinking does this bring, and new ways of thinking about traffic safety culture, and how do I want to use those new ways of thinking to approach things differently? All of our work, in every aspect, we reveal lots of misperceptions of traffic safety culture. So they are rampant. They are everywhere. They're between stakeholders. They're between users of the road system. They're between stakeholders' perceptions of road users. They're just everywhere. And all those misperceptions are really interesting to lean into. I think whenever I see a misperception, I want to say, I wonder why that exists. And I wonder what else that might be leading to in terms of associated beliefs and subsequent behaviors. And where might there be an opportunity to lean into challenging those misperceptions? So we have to go in, again, with that in our heads, because as we engage in conversations with folks, what we're often hearing is their perceptions of things. Of course, that's where we're all operating. But when I acknowledge I have misperceptions, other people have misperceptions, then it allows me sometimes to ask some different questions and to go down some different roads that I might not have gone had I not recognized some of my beliefs or misperceptions. So it's just another one to sort of hold out there and consistently ask yourself. I think Wes mentioned this. When we think about safety culture, and we do work in other spaces besides traffic safety, but when we think about culture, or traffic safety culture in particular, overwhelmingly people recognize it as important. Organizationally, we say like a critical part of a good organization is a good culture. And we'll see that too in terms of aspects of safety, a safety culture. But we can all struggle with having a working definition or thoughts on how to grow it or engage in it. And so let's just acknowledge that, but not let that hold us back. Let's hold that up as an interesting question to sort of say, yeah, I want to hold that it's important and I don't know how to define it. And just holding that is okay. Like, that can give you a space then to walk down a new path and explore it. I think it is important, and there are lots of different mechanisms that people have used to try to measure it and to try to grow it. So know that some others have walked there before you, but let's lean into it because we all sort of intuitively have that sense. And as we think about leaning into it, it absolutely takes leadership. And by leadership, there's an element of positional leadership. In other words, positional leaders have to have some buy-in there to maybe allocate resources, time, energy, things like that. For sure, there's that component. But there's also skills we need to grow, leadership skills we need to grow in this space. And part of those skills involve adaptive challenges. So being able to be in a space Whereas leaders, we don't know the answers. So we're comfortable saying like culture is important and I don't know how to grow it. Or culture is important and I don't know how to define it. And that's okay. We're gonna walk into that. So it's a variety of different skills that we may need to hold there. And knowing that to do this work, we may need to focus on some of those skills. And then for sure it takes time. Culture is a big piece, and this is not going to happen overnight. But if you work in the transportation space, you know that. You know that construction projects take many years. You may think about various plans that are developed that are 50-year plans. So especially in the transportation space, we're used to longer time zones, time scales, and that's okay. So, but we have to give ourselves permission that it's going to take some time and need some space, and that's all okay. So those are my key takeaways. On the next slide is just a little bit of information if you want more about the pooled fund. Also, the pooled fund is seeking to start an additional phase, phase 3 in October of 2024. So Minnesota is currently a part of phase 2. I don't know their intentions about phase 3, but still you can be a part of it. You can check out that website. You can potentially get on an email list to be contacted. And then if you're a part of other states, you can also seek to potentially join the pooled fund and have a voice in defining it or giving it direction. So thank you so much for your time. Thank you so much for your engagement on this. And I think we're going to shift to Q&A now.
Yeah, thanks, Jay. I was going to put in a plug for the pooled fund. So do we have, 17 states that are participating right now?
Right now, there are about 20, I think. And
Okay.
they're slowly starting to think about the next round. I think it's 20.
That's great. So yeah, if you're interested in that, definitely reach out to Jay. Like he said, Minnesota is a part of that, and it's been really an advantage because by pooling our resources together, we get much more bang for the buck, if you say. But we do have, we're going to open it for questions. And I do see one that's popped in. It's kind of long, and I think it's for Jay, but it's, this is so helpful for our town's Bike and Pedestrian Advisory Committee, which is comprised of community volunteers who try to push the town towards a traffic safety culture that is implemented in policy and projects. So her question is, have communities incorporated traffic safety culture in traffic safety plans or adopting a Vision Zero policy?
Wes, I can talk to that. Do you have anything you want to say right off the bat on that?
I guess one thing I would say is maybe this current period where there is a fair bit of federal funding available through the Safe Streets for All grants and other programs, this is a really good time if you are a local to work on how to implement traffic safety culture into your traffic safety plans and Vision Zero policy. I think if that funding is there, be bold. This is a good opportunity to do it.
Yeah, I think that's a huge piece. I think SS4As, the Safe Streets for All, they are required to do a sort of safety plan. They're also required to have a leadership commitment. Both of those are aspects that I think if you look at the Safe Street, SS4A grants, you can find out if any are in your area, and then you can lean into participating in those or contributing to those, but then also calling them out for what was your leadership declaration and how can we leverage that leadership declaration to also help establish some shared values about traffic safety, maybe in our jurisdiction, which may fall within that. But I would say overall, your question is a good one. I think absolutely when we think about folks who are even starting to embrace aspects of Vision Zero, they are beginning to declare aspects of what they value in their culture. So that's beginning that work around culture. I'm not as familiar with as specific ones that have and their actions integrated in. I think many efforts to improve vulnerable road user safety, pedestrian advocacy, walker roller advocacy groups are basically doing traffic safety culture work. They may not label it that way, but they're seeking to grow shared values and beliefs. I think there's some elements of the traffic safety work that they might be able to benefit from. And I think they could absolutely be an entity to look at that research roadmap and again, scan some of those research need statements and just sort of, not that you have to take them as is, you absolutely could, but you could scan them and say, what is piquing our interest? What are we doing that's like this? Or what's a question that we've been holding about traffic safety that kind of is talked about in this research needs statement? What if we took this research needs statement and we modified it to our context, and then we thought about doing a small project around that specifically in our jurisdiction and our context? Like, you don't have to think about doing traffic safety culture work for the nation. You could do a traffic safety culture research project that's just in your immediate context and your immediate area. And then think about finding, potential partners in terms of funding or other things, or whether you take it on internally. But I think what the research roadmap helps you is to just think a little bit differently through this lens of traffic safety culture to say, yeah, it's not like somebody knows how to do all this and they're just not telling us. No, it's more that this is an emergent field, and the roadmap can give us some ideas about where we might take a bite, and we could absolutely do it in a small context. Like, to me, some of the more viable work to do this is in small context, because it's much more fundable, and to get something small and contained where you could then wrap a little bit of evaluation or learning around it and see things. So I think your question is a good one. I don't have any great examples off the top of my head, but I would point you back to the roadmap as a tool that you might bring to that group. They don't have to read the whole report. They can read just the research needs statements, or look at some of those diagrams and see some of the things that are interesting them.
Great, thanks. So someone had asked about the TRB format. Wes, you were kind of talking about that, and I explained that is the Transportation Research Board. But do you have any other guidance for them as far as the format?
Sure. The format, this is specific to Transportation Research Board and how research needs statements get put into the funnel for the collaborative research program. So NCHRP, which is the National Highway Cooperative Research Program, is one of several that are sort of fostered by the Transportation Research Board of the National Academies of Sciences, with the idea being that there are these multi-year cycles where different Transportation Research Board committees will write typically research needs statements, put them into the pipeline. They get voted on by different committees. I believe it's the AASHTO Committee on Safety would be the one looking at these kinds of research needs statements. And then sometimes they end up getting into the pipeline. There are a few different committees that do look at these. So that's sort of the general format. What I do want to point out, and Jay was sort of hinting at this, if you're looking at the research roadmap and you're trying to scan through it and make sense of, well, how does this apply to me? One thing I do want to point out is who the intended audience or potential partners are, because while we wrote this report with specifically AASHTO and state DOTs as the intended audience, it's not limited to just them. And in fact, we call out at several times that maybe this research would be of benefit to a local agency, like a local DOT or a public works department or your state highway safety office, or this would be something that, say, the AAA Foundation for Traffic Safety could pull in. We had a lot of interests and partnership with folks from FHWA or NHTSA when we were working on this. And so and that might be one way to look at it, is to look at what those indexed topics are, because some of them relate to, say, infrastructure or behavioral programs or equity. Look at who the intended audiences are, and then think through maybe what you as a local agency might need. And I see a question of, can you define AASHTO? That is the American Association of State Highway and Transportation Officials. So it is a larger organization with representatives from state DOTs. I think AASHTO publishes the Green Book. I hope I'm not flying off the cuff on that. I think that's right, though. The Green Book being the Manual for Roadway Design. I don't remember what the actual policy name is.
I'm glad you answered that question.
Yeah.
We use so many acronyms and sometimes it's like, oh yeah, I know what it is, but I can't tell you the name, the actual name. So thank you. I don't know, Jay, if you've already answered this from that first question, but what recommendation would you have for an organization like a DOT to get started on traffic safety culture efforts?
Yeah, so I mean, I think it's similar to what I was saying before, but I think it would be to find some interested folks within your organization, some people who have some interest, some passion. I think if you could find some leaders behind that, that's always helpful, right? Because sometimes leaders can bring resources, but I don't think you have to get stuck there. And then I think it would be convening them and talking a little bit about some of the ideas we've shared today and looking at the research roadmap, and then just sort of saying what within this roadmap really interests us, and what might we, by our sort of voting with our feet, in other words, what we are drawn to go towards, we would look at and saying as a piece that we might try to do. It might be leveraging the research needs statement as it is and seeking to advocate that it go into the NCHRP pipeline like Wes was talking about. And if it goes into that pipeline and is sponsored and gets voted in, that brings resources to potentially do that work, right? They have financing to do that. But it could also be saying, like, maybe we take this and we would try to adapt or rewrite this research needs statement to a smaller scale. And it might be something that our DOT would be willing to fund through its own research entity, its own research, enterprise or activities. Or even to say, maybe it's an idea we then bring to the traffic safety culture pooled fund, and to sort of say, would they do something with that? So I think my piece is, we all are in this space where we're like, traffic safety culture is important. We all get that, but we can feel stifled, or I don't know what to do next. And I would just encourage you to walk into the unknown. It's okay. You don't have to walk into it knowing exactly what the path forward is. Look at the research roadmap, see where some interest is, and start to evolve that and connect with other players as a way to get started on it. Wes, and you probably got some good ideas too. Anything you want to add to that?
Honestly, I think you covered it. I'm not sure I have much to add here.
Great, thank you. I don't see any other questions in the chat. I know we had our evaluation slide up earlier. Just want to encourage people to please do fill out those evaluation forms because we do look at those. But with that, I want to thank both Jay and Wes. This is obviously a passion of mine. And in Minnesota, we named our webinar a hot dish for a reason. That is part of our culture. So I do want to thank you both for coming, taking the time today to present. And with that, we can encourage everyone to do the survey, and just want to put a plug in for our next webinar. It's called the Full Court Press, Judicial Perspectives on Impaired Driving, and that will be in November. But thank you everyone for participating today. Don't forget to follow Minnesota on X now instead of Twitter, and we do have a Facebook page as well as our webpage, which is located below. So thank you everyone for coming.
Take care.